Alright guys, BLM here and we're back with a new video. In this video I'll be going over 5 series of Super Sentai to watch if you're a beginner to the show or if you're a fan of Power Rangers. Now if you don't know what Super Sentai is a Japanese tokusatsu show that is aimed for children and is also the source material for Power Rangers. As an enormous fan of Power Rangers as a kid, I learned about Super Sentai when doing research on the show years later and finally gave it a shot, and I ended up really enjoying it. Something that's really interesting about watching Sentai in general is you start to understand why certain decisions were made in the production of the Power Rangers adaptations, as they could only do so much with the footage that they were given. A disclaimer that I should give is that at the time of the recording, there are 42 seasons of Super Sentai, with the 43rd right around the corner. Now these seasons are mostly around 50 episodes, with all the episodes being about half an hour. But to be honest, even I haven't watched every season of this show. I've watched 26 out of the 42 seasons, and I've watched bits and pieces of other ones. I should also state that these 5 seasons aren't necessarily my favorite seasons out there, they're just the ones that I think are a good place to start. Now obviously you could start with the very beginning of Gokaiger, but the problem with that is that not every episode is subtitled, so if you want to start from the beginning you're going to have to go through some gaps, so I feel like it's much better just to start at a later point. Now these seasons aren't ranked in any way, they're not in order of any importance, they're merely in chronological order. With that out of the way, let's get started. Now, the first season I would recommend isn't really even a season that I actually like, but for Power Ranger fans, I do feel like this is a must-watch, and that is Kyoryū Sentai Zyuranger, which was the series that was later adapted into Season 1 of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. As I said, I'm not a big fan of this season, but as a Power Rangers fan, I do think it is fun to watch, as you get to see the original stories that were told with the footage that was used in Mighty Morphin. The main reason I don't like this series is how every episode is structured, where in this season, there isn't just a monster of the week, there's also a kid of the week, as this show pretty much focuses on the protagonist saving kids from Bandora, who is the original version of Rita, as she constantly kidnaps kids due to a plot point I won't really spoil here. Now this ruins a lot of the filler episodes as they spend way too much time with the kid of the week, and usually the kid's pretty annoying to begin with. Outside of that though, there are some pretty good plot lines in the series, especially everything involving the Dekaranger, which is the original version of the Green Ranger, and this really brings context as to why the Green Ranger wasn't in the episodes more in Mighty Morphin. Overall, I would recommend this season as it is fun to watch as a Power Rangers fan, and it is also a good place to start, not just because this is a star of Power Rangers, but also because this was a pretty important season in Super Sentai history, where it created a formula with its plot and cast that would be followed for years to come. However, if you don't care about these particular things, if you're not a big Mighty Morphin Power Rangers fan, I don't think this is the season for you, and I recommend some seasons that I'm going to be talking about a bit later. So the second season I would recommend is probably my favorite season in the entire series, and that is Mirai Sentai Timeranger, which was later adapted into Power Rangers Time Force. Now with Time Force being one of my favorite Power Rangers series, this Sentai series is just as good, as the two share many plot points and have a lot of similar characters. It is really tough to rank the two though, because Timeranger does some really great things that aren't done in Time Force, and vice versa. I do think Timeranger does a deeper dive into its characters, with Time Blue and Time Yellow being much more developed and much more interesting than their Power Ranger counterparts. I do feel like the relationship between Time Red and Time Yellow isn't as well done here as it is in Time Force, but it is still done adequately. And Time Ranger is really outshined by Time Force when it comes to the villains though. But then again, I do think Time Force has some of the best villains across both series. Now while there aren't many differences between Time Ranger and Time Force, the biggest one is just how much darker the show is. Even though I would say that Time Force has some of the darkest themes in all of Power Rangers, Time Ranger just takes it a step ahead and does some really cool things with the time travel theme as well. Overall, I would recommend this season for people who are looking for a strong narrative with some darker themes and an okay cast. And if you like Power Rangers Time Force, you're definitely going to like this season as well. And if you do enjoy seasons like this, these darker seasons, I would also recommend seasons like Jetman and Zyuranger to continue on after this. So now the third season that I would recommend is pretty much in direct contrast to Timeranger, where obviously that season was a darker season. This one's a pretty lighthearted season, and that is Tokusou Sentai Dekaranger, which was later adapted into Power Rangers S.P.D. Now this season has a really strong cast, probably a stronger cast overall than Timeranger, though Timeranger was filled with more developed characters. They just weren't that fun. I feel like Dekaranger's cast is much more fun and really more memorable at the end of the day. Now these characters are, for the most part, pretty different from their Power Ranger counterparts, though there are some that are exactly the same, like Doggy Kruger, though he does have a more ridiculous looking outfit. Story of the season is pretty radically different from S.P.D, where S.P.D has an overarching narrative that involves the central antagonist, which is Grum. But in Dekaranger, it follows an episodic structure where most episodes are self-contained, though an enemy that does show up from time to time does end up becoming the final villain. Dekaranger also takes place in the present, unlike S.P.D, and has a strong detective theme, which leads to most episodes feeling like an old detective show with appropriate music as well. Overall, Dekaranger is a great season start as it's not very plot intensive, and it's just a fun ride with some really fun characters, but if you're looking for something with more substance, I would say it starts elsewhere. Now for my fourth recommendation, which is actually kind of tough to recommend for newcomers, but it is Kaizoku Sentai Gokaiger, which was the 35th anniversary season of Super Sentai and one of the biggest pieces of fan service in the history of media that got completely butchered when it got brought over to America as Power Rangers Super Mega Force. Now this fan service is what makes it tough for me to recommend to beginners, though if you are very familiar with Power Rangers, I do feel like you could still give this one a shot, but you will be spoiled in some older Sentai seasons. I'd like to do a future video where I talk about Gokaiger in depth, but since this is a no spoiler video, let me just say that this season is filled with cameos and callbacks to previous seasons of Sentai, with numerous tribute episodes happening throughout the season that conclude plot lines from previous series. Gokaiger also does a really good job with world building for the franchise, which is something that Power Rangers is really lacking. It fills in a lot of plot details from previous series that really expands the series' continuity, such as wrapping up a massive cliffhanger at the end of Jetman, which aired 20 years previously, and also connecting itself to certain movies, and even finishing a certain plot line from Timeranger. Outside of its really interesting world building, there are also some really good characters on this show, which is why I do really feel like this would appeal to first-time viewers. However, at the end of the day, I do think this is probably my favorite cast in Sentai history, with each member having an interesting personality and background. And I do think Gokai Red is probably my favorite ranger in all of Super Sentai. While these things are great, something this season doesn't do great though is its villains. The villains suck, they're pretty boring, they're really just evil for the sake of being evil. Overall, I would recommend Gokaiger to any fan of either series, it's just a matter of when do you watch it. If you don't mind being spoiled on certain plot points from other series and don't mind having references or cameos that you won't get, I would say watch Gokaiger now. As a Power Ranger fan, I'm sure you'll get some of these references anyway. But if you want to get more enjoyment out of the season, I would say wait until you watch a lot more of the seasons that came before it, though I don't think it's necessary to have a base enjoyment of the series. Now for my final recommendation, which is a season that has more relevance now than ever before, and that is Tokumei Sentai Go Busters, which is currently, at the time of this recording, being adapted into Power Rangers Beast Morphers. Go Busters has a spy theme, though there's a lot of focus on technology. A cool thing about this season, from a Power Ranger fan, is the fact that there's a lot of little nods to the Power Rangers franchise, such as the morphing call being It's Morphing Time, and the mechas being called Megazords. The more I think about this season, the more I realize that it's kind of like a middle ground compared to these previous seasons I've talked about. While there's a season like Timeranger that's pretty dark, a season like Dekaranger which is pretty light, a season like Gokaiger which you can't really watch due to the references, I think Go Busters is kind of a perfect mix of all of those. The cast is solid and well developed, but to be honest, it's probably not as memorable as some of these other seasons in the grand scheme of things, especially comparing it to the casts of like Dekaranger and Gokaiger. The overall narrative is pretty strong in this season, but I do feel like it gets a bit of a slow start. However, the final arc is probably one of my favorite arcs in the entire series. Overall, I do think Go Busters is a good starting point, especially now that Beast Morphers is currently airing, but also because of all the references to Mighty Morphin and just the fact that it's a strong season in general. So there we go, those are 5 series of Super Sentai that I would recommend watching as a starting point for Power Ranger fans. Now, some other seasons I would also recommend that didn't quite make this list, but are good seasons to watch in the future, are Jetman, Zyuranger, Carranger, Mega Ranger, Gingaman, Bokenger, Kyoryū, and Zyuranger. And also, if you're willing to give a really good parody a shot that has a lot of cameos and a lot of callbacks, kind of like Gokaiger, I would say you should give Akiba Ranger a shot as well. So there you go, that's everything I wanted to say to prepare you to watch some Super Sentai seasons. So yeah, thank you for watching.